Hello, everyone. It is still December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, and I am ready to record part two of my two-part video series here on Old Testament history from creation to the birth of Christ. In the first lecture, we looked first at prehistory. That would be creation, fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Then we looked at the period of the patriarchs. That's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And that takes us roughly from 2000 to 1500 BC. Then we looked at the Exodus of Moses out of Egypt, followed by the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. And that period of Exodus and conquest takes us from roughly 1500 to almost 1000. And we ended with the period of the judges. The most famous of those judges was Samson. We looked at his story. We also ended with the story of Ruth, which takes place during the time of the judges. And I had a little brain lapse. I forgot Ruth's kinsman redeemer. His name was Boaz, if you were wondering from the last video. And the last thing I said is that Ruth, even though she's a Moabitess, not a Jewish woman, she ends up being the great-grandmother of King David. And now, in the second video, we will start with the period of the monarchy, which is followed by the divided monarchy, which is followed by the exile, and then finally a period where the famous Hanukkah comes from. So let's start with the monarchy, and this begins actually about 1100 BC, not with the monarchy, but the monarchy begins with Samuel, who is the last of the judges. He is born probably about 1100 BC, and he brings to a close the period of the judges, which follows the period of the conquest. Now, Samuel's mother, as so often happens in Scripture, is a woman named Hannah who is barren. But she prays, and God answers her prayer and gives her a boy named Samuel. But God wants her to surrender that boy to be a priest in his service. Later on, by the way, he gives Hannah more children. But Samuel is brought over to the high priest Eli and of the tribe of Levi. And Samuel is raised as a priest. And from a very early age, God speaks to him directly. Sort of sadly for him, one of the first things that Samuel actually prophesies to Eli, the high priest, is that Eli's sons, who would have followed him, are evil and will end up being destroyed for their sins. And it will actually be Samuel who follows after Eli, becoming both a sort of priest and a judge, and even a kind of a prophet. Now, he is one of the great and noble characters. He appears in a book called First Samuel. By Second Samuel, he's gone, but First and Second Samuel take their name from him. And what happens is after Samuel is kind of age and is leading the people as a judge, the people come to him and demand a king. They want a king. And the real reason they want a king is because they want to be like everybody else and like all the other nations, and they're envious and foolish. And God tells them, you do not want a king. A king will abuse you, will put your men in danger, will steal your women for his hair, will do all of these terrible things. You don't want a king. I am your king. But the people insist, and God allows Samuel to anoint a king. And this is really not what God wanted, but God will still use it because the second king, David, will be the great ancestor of the Messiah. Now, the first king chosen was Saul, and Saul is a head taller than all the men in this time, a noble person, exactly the kind of person you would expect to be a king. And Samuel anoints Saul and tells him, obey the Lord and you will be a king and God will bless your family. But unfortunately, Saul was an impulsive man. He was disobedient. He did sins which may not seem big to us today, but they were big to God because he disobeyed. One time after a victory, he was supposed to destroy everything, but instead he kept it, he said, so he could sacrifice it to God. But he was really doing it for his own glory. Another time, he was waiting for Samuel to come and do the sacrifice, but Samuel was late. And so instead of waiting, Saul went ahead and did it himself, even though that was not his office. And eventually, because of these sins, which don't seem big to us, I would say, but are big because they show his disobedience and refusal to follow God's rules, because of that, Saul prophesies that the kingdom will be torn away from Saul and given to someone else. And Samuel is sent by God to anoint that new king. He goes to the house of Jesse and he tells Jesse, one of your sons is God's anointed. And the word anointed, by the way, is Messiah. And I am here to anoint your son. Bring them. And one by one, Jesse brings all of his tall, strong, heroic sons, one by one. But to each one of them, Samuel says, this is not the Lord's anointed. One by one until all the sons are finished. And he says, Jesse, have you no other sons? Well, I've got one son, a little ruddy-headed runt of a boy named David, but he's out taking care of the sheep. And Samuel says, have him come immediately. And the moment David walked in, Samuel kneeled down and said, behold, this is the Lord's anointed. And everybody's confused. What are you talking about? He's a runt. And Samuel explains that God does not see as man sees. Man sees the outside, but God sees the heart. And David would be known as a man after God's own heart. Well, filled with God's Spirit, David heard that Saul was having a problem. They were still fighting the Philistines, and the Philistines had a giant, what they called the Nephilim, this super giant with weapons that make him sound like a hero out of the Iliad and Odyssey, right, with this giant spear. And he said, you Israelites, we are going to decide this once and for all. I will come forward, choose your champion, and we will have a duel, and the winner will take all. But all of Saul's men were terrified. He even offered them a huge reward and the hand of his daughter in marriage, but all were terrified. And then along comes David, the little runt of a guy, fresh from the taking care of the sheep. And he says, I will do this, right? And when he hears about the taunts of Goliath, the giant Philistine, he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? And he went to Saul, and said, I will do it. And Saul tried to put his armor upon David, but David was too short. And he said, I don't need armor. He said, when I take care of a sheep and a lion or a bear or a wolf comes, I kill it myself. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of those wild animals. And he took his slingshot and he put a stone and he twisted it around and threw it. It landed right in his forehead and embedded, and he killed the giant Goliath and cut off his head. And immediately a royal robe was put on him. He was eventually given Michal, 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 the daughter of Saul, to be his wife. And when Saul's noble son Jonathan saw all of this, he immediately ended up with a bond of love between David. And David and Jonathan are two of the most famous friends in history or literature. They are not gay, that is our problem, but they are men who love each other. And there was one time after Jonathan died that David said, your love was even better than the love of women. Okay, but this is a Semitic place where they're not so nervous like we are about close male friendships. And so, again, they're as legendary as the famous Achilles and Patroclus is the friendship between Jonathan and David. And even though Jonathan knows that David is going to supplant him, Jonathan would normally follow his father, Saul, and be the next king, but he willingly gives over to David, whom he loves and whom he recognizes as God's anointed. Well, he marries the daughter, he becomes part of the court, and David, some of you might know, is famous for writing many of the Psalms, and David played the harp and sang. And towards the end of his life, Saul was tormented by an evil spirit as he sort of gave way to a kind of madness, a spiritual madness. And the only thing that could soothe him was when David played the harp and sang for him. Maybe he even sang the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd. And it would calm Saul. Even so, Saul was filled with envy and fear of jealousy of young David. And he even tried to throw a spear and kill him while he was playing the harp. But David escaped, and he would do nothing to harm God's anointed, because Saul was also God's anointed. David was and would follow him. But for now, David was, stayed true to the rightful king of Israel. Well, again, many times Saul tried to kill David. His own son Jonathan took David's side and warned David and told him to flee. And poor David had to flee and live among the Philistines, the very people whose hero Goliath he had killed. And the only way he was able to survive is he pretended like he was insane, like he was crazy, and the Philistines allowed him to live there. But always he was on the side of the Jews, always trying to reconcile with Saul. 2 times David came upon Saul in a cave and had an easy opportunity to kill him. But instead, he cut off a bit of his robe, Saul, and later on held it up and said, "Look, I could have killed you, but you are God's anointed. I am not your enemy." But again, Saul was filled with envy and rage. In the end, there was another war, and in that war, Saul and Jonathan died. Well, actually, Jonathan died. Saul was injured, and not wanting the disgrace, he actually took his own life. And there's really only 2 Old Testament characters who die, in a sense, by suicide. One is Samson, and the other is Saul. And interestingly, Samson and Saul are the most Greek heroes of the Old Testament. One could imagine them like a Hercules or an Oedipus as part of a Greek tragedy where they are larger than life and noble, but they've got some kind of flaw that always takes them down. And so, actually, later on, Milton wrote a Greek tragedy called Samson Agonistes about Samson. No one's written one about Saul, but they should, because again, he very much is like a Greek hero, even more than like a Jewish hero. Well, David becomes king about 1000 BC, and David unites all of Israel, and he takes Jerusalem, and he makes Jerusalem the capital. And he is the best of all possible kings, beloved of God, beloved of his people, always pious and whatnot. But alas, he too has his flaws. And one day, maybe about halfway through his reign, he was on his roof and he saw a beautiful woman named Bathsheba taking a bath on the roof, and he fell in love with her. Maybe we should say lust with her. And he called for her to come to him, and he slept with her, and she conceived. Now, she was a married woman. She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of the noblest and most loyal of David's soldiers. And if he was a Hittite, it's very possible that Bathsheba also was not Jewish, but she is going to become part of the Messianic line, just like Ruth and Tamar and Rahab before, as I talked about in the previous video. So as soon as he found out that Bathsheba was pregnant, what he did is he called Uriah, that was her husband, called him to come back from the field so he could speak with him. And they ate and drank together, and he said, "Now please go back home, sleep with your wife, have a good time." But Uriah was noble, and he said, "How can I take pleasure in my wife and in a fancy bed when my men are on the ground having no comforts?" And so he refused. And it's a shame because his noble and godly refusal is what leads to his death. Now David knows that he will know that this child is not his because he's been away for so long. And so what he does is he sends a message with one of his commanders who says, in the next fight, let Uriah go in the front of the charge and then pull back and leave him there. And that's what happens, and Uriah is killed. So David doesn't kill him, but he basically conspires in his death. So we have someone who commits adultery and conspiracy for murder. And this is God's anointed. But the Bible does not soft pedal things. This is also the days before the Holy Spirit is indwelling God's people directly. Well, Bathsheba does have a child, okay? But then the very brave prophet Nathan comes to David and wants to accuse him. But he knows that this is risky because David is king. So he saves himself by telling a story, a kind of parable. He says, "Oh Lord, let me tell you a story and you give me your judgment." He says, there was a poor man. He had nothing. All he had was this little ewe lamb that he loved as if it were his own child. But next door to him was a rich man, and this rich man had everything. And a guest came to his house, and rather than give that guest out of his own larder, He went to the poor man, stole the lamb, killed it, and served that lamb. And he said to King David, what should be done with this man? And he said, this man deserves death. And Nathan said, you are the man. Everything was given to you, and yet you stole the only thing that Uriah had. You must repent. And unlike Saul, who even when he committed small sins never repented, David immediately repented and fell to his knees and confessed. And if you ever read Psalm 51, it records the contrition and confession of David, who knows that he's not only sinned against Uriah, but ultimately has sinned against God. But that sin has consequences, and the child dies. But God is merciful. Bathsheba gets pregnant again and gives birth to Solomon, who will be the next great king and who will be part of the messianic line. So again, you see how God is always protecting the bloodline of the Messiah. And even when we as human beings do evil and bad things, God can still make good out of it. This is the story of the Old Testament. It's also the story of the New Testament, of the God who can bring good even out of evil, even out of our own evil choices. Now, I mentioned before that David had been married to Michal, but he had put her aside for a very important reason. Midway through his reign, before his sin with Bathsheba, and after David had taken Jerusalem, he went and got the Ark of the Covenant and he brought it to Jerusalem. And he brought it with singing and dancing and great festivity. And David himself was so happy that the Lord's Ark and the Lord's presence was coming that he began to dance, kicking up his legs, and he was wearing a little ephod, so he was probably even necessarily revealing himself. But it was right to do this. David was willing to humble himself out of praise and celebration of God's glory. But Michal, who was obviously very, very aristocratic in the negative sense, looked down on David and despised him in her heart. And because of that, God cursed her, and she remained barren for the rest of her life. And Bathsheba would be the true love of David's life. He would have other wives. This is why God told him, you don't want a king. This is what he's going to do. But the true love of David was Bathsheba, and God still used her to give birth to Solomon. But folks, we need to understand this. The God of the Bible is a forgiving God. He forgives God, and David is still saved, as we would say. But folks, our choices and decisions still have consequences. David was still a man after God's own heart, and God would bless him, but his sinful choice brought consequences. Ever since he did that sin, his house was in a mess, right? He brought strife within his house. Not that long after, one of his sons actually raped his half sister. David's the same father, different mothers. And then after he raped her, rather than at least marrying her and making her, he then despised her and sent her away. And David said nothing. Then the girl, her brother, came and killed his half-brother, right? Who had done that terrible thing. And still David said nothing. I believe he said nothing because he knew of his own sins, and in a sense he lost his moral authority as the father of his family and the head of his household. And again, it's David is one of the most amazing characters. He's a historical character, but he's also a literary figure, and his story arc is an amazing one. This man after God's own heart who yet does these terrible sins, but pays the consequence. That son of his who killed his half-brother, and David still did not punish him, his name was Absalom. And later on, he would rebel against his own father, would humiliate him by sleeping with his father's concubines on a roof to say, I am the true heir. And he led a civil war, and David had to flee for safety. In the end, David was saved, and Absalom died. He got his hair caught up in the tree and was killed by one of David's soldiers, one of his commanders, and it was restored to David. But again, the shame of it all is how David, by his sin, made a shambles of his family. Now, one of the good things David did before the sin with Bathsheba is he prayed to God and said, God, I would like to build you a house. I have this palace. Let me build you a temple. And God said to him, because you have prayed this prayer, I will build you a house. You will always have a descendant to be king, leading up, of course, to the Messiah. But he said, David, you are a man of blood, and you cannot build my temple. That would be done instead by his son Solomon. And Solomon, as you probably heard, is the third king and the last king of the united monarchy. I'll explain that in a moment. And Solomon was young, and when he was young, God appeared to him in a vision and said, I will grant to you any wish you want. And amazingly, he did not ask for military power. He did not ask for wealth or women or anything like that. He said, O Lord, I am a young man. How can I rule these people? Give me wisdom. And when Solomon said wisdom, he didn't mean make me a rocket scientist. He meant give me discernment that I can understand right from wrong and can be a good judge that Israel needs as a king. And God was so impressed, he said, because you have asked for this and not wealth and power, I will give you all those things together with wisdom, and you will be the wisest man who ever lived. He's the one who wrote most of the Proverbs, who wrote Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon, and his wisdom was legendary, so much so that the Queen of Sheba left Ethiopia and came on a long journey just to sit at Solomon's feet and learn his wisdom. As God has promised, Solomon would build the temple. He hired a man named Hiram and all these great craftsmen and artisans and built the mighty temple to God, to Yahweh. And in the Holy of Holies of the temple is where the Ark of the Covenant was put. But as great and as wise as he was, Solomon made the mistake of marrying not just many wives, but many foreign wives, including an Egyptian wife. Now, he probably did this to cement his alliances, but those foreign wives who were idolaters ended up leading Solomon into idolatry, and he was corrupted by it, and his reign did not end well. It's very, very sad. And in fact, what really happened, it was so sad, is the kingdom ended up being divided. Solomon had a son named Rehoboam, but there was a rebellious person who didn't like Solomon, and his name was Jeroboam, and we started having a civil war. Now, Rehoboam, who was the rightful heir and son of Solomon, and therefore the grandson of David, if he had listened to wisdom, he would have been okay. But rather than speaking gently to the disaffected Jews who were following the rebel, he turned on them and promised them only punishment. And this caused a great deal of anger, and a civil war broke out. And what happened is that the united monarchy of, of David, really, Saul wasn't quite united yet, but of David and Solomon, that united monarchy was split in half into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The southern kingdom, which is down in Judah, is centered around Jerusalem. And the southern kingdom was built of the tribe of Judah, that's the Messianic tribe, and Benjamin, who was the beloved son of Jacob, because he was the son of his beloved Rachel and the brother of Joseph. And so the southern kingdom stayed loyal around Judah, stayed loyal, and that all of those kings were following in the footsteps of David and Solomon, that bloodline. But the northern kingdom broke away. And the northern kingdom was the other 10 tribes. And the northern kingdom came to be called Samaria. And although they remained Jews, they did not really follow the law. They built themselves a rival holy place up in the north and often gave way to idolatry. And this divided monarchy would last for several hundred years. And I hate to say it, but every single one of the northern kings was bad. They often gave way to idolatry. They did not fight idolatry. They did not obey God. They did not do as David had done. The worst king of the north was Ahab. That's where Herman Melville got the name for his Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. And Ahab, he was bad enough to begin with, but to make it worse, he married Jezebel, a princess of the Phoenicians. Those are the people who sacrificed their own children to the god Baal. And Jezebel led him astray, just as Solomon's foreign wives led him astray. And Ahab became a tyrannical king. Now, the way that Israel works, in the beginning, God's most anointed people that he appointed to lead were the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Then eventually it gave way to the judges. And as I said, Samuel was the last judge who gave way to the first king, Saul, and then David. And so after the judges, the kings become sort of the vehicle of God's voice and will. But when the kings start to go bad during the divided monarchy, that's when God sends the prophets. Now, Moses was a prophet as well, but that's when he starts sending more prophets, and it's the prophets who become the sort of center of God's voice as the kings become worse and worse. Now, the great two prophets who didn't write a book, okay, but are very important, the first great prophet was Elijah. And Elijah had the courage to speak out against Ahab and especially his evil wife Jezebel. God used him to perform amazing miracles. He raised someone from the dead. Elijah prayed, and it did not rain for a long, long time in Israel until there was a drought. People were dying. But then when Ezekiel prayed again, God sent rain. But the most famous thing that Ezekiel did, one of the most dramatic chapters in the whole Bible, is a contest that took place on the top of Mount Carmel. And Elijah was again attacking the northern king Ahab for for giving way to Jezebel and the Phoenicians and their evil Baal worship. And finally he said, "We are going to have a contest. I will come representing Yahweh, the true God, and you bring your worshippers of Baal, and we will see which God is stronger." And what they do is on the top of Mount Carmel, they build two altars. And the whole point was, we're going to build an altar and let's see whose God can set that altar on fire and burn up the sacrifice. But Elijah wants to make this dramatic. And so, even though there's a drought going on, he fills up gallon after gallon and pours it on top of the fire and in the trench around the fire. So it's impossible that this fire could ever be lit drenched with water. Now, he told the Baal worshippers to go first. And they prayed and prayed and they cut themselves and they beat themselves, but nothing happened. Then Elijah made a simple prayer, and immediately a thunderbolt came down. It set the fire ablaze. It licked up all the water in the trench and everything, and it was lit on fire. And then Elijah himself executed the evil priests of Baal. A dramatic moment where he's telling the Israelites, choose whom you're going to obey, like Joshua. As for me and my house, we will follow the Lord. And it's a dramatic moment. But then, oddly enough, when Elijah hears that Jezebel has sworn that she will kill him, he actually gets nervous and runs and runs and runs from one end of the Holy Land to the other end of the Holy Land to get away. And God meets him by a cave. And it says that first there was a thunderstorm, but God was not in the thunderstorm. And then there was lightning, but God was not in the lightning. There was fire, but God was not in the fire. And then Elijah heard a still, small voice, a gentle whisper. And he put on his hood and went into the cave, and God spoke to him. By the way, before this, Elijah prayed, and it began to rain again. Well, Elijah was in many ways the greatest of the prophets, and he passed down his mantle to Elisha, Elijah and Elisha. And Elisha would go on to do even more miracles than Elijah. He also raised someone from the dead. He allowed oil to last for a long, long time. He did all these wonderful, wonderful miracles. But they are the two most famous. But after them will become the major prophets who wrote books, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And they began to warn the southern and northern kingdom that disaster was coming, but they did not believe. Now, in the year 722, the Assyrians rushed in and seized control of the northern kingdom. They killed many of them. Then they took the noblest of the northern kingdom of the Sumerians and sent them into exile. Right? So they would never. And the northern kingdom collapsed, and it would never be rebuilt. Basically, the 10 tribes became assimilated amongst the heathens, the Gentiles, and they would become the Samaritans. And if you know the New Testament, you will know that the full-blooded Jews looked upon the Samaritans as half-breeds and looked down upon them and all that sort of thing. It goes all the way back to that northern kingdom and the loss of those 10 tribes. So all that's left is the southern kingdom of Judah with Judah and Benjamin. And again, from Judah would come the Messianic line. Now, Judah would have been destroyed right afterwards by the Assyrians, but she was saved by a good king named Hezekiah. He finally stopped the degradation of morality. He broke up the pagan rituals and all that sort of stuff, and he instituted real worship again. And it was a real boon, and he was beloved of God. And God even gave him a sign allowing him extra years to his life. But he was followed by a terrible, terrible king named Manasseh, and another terrible king, and then another good king named Josiah came. But by then it was too late. God was going to destroy Judah, but he allowed her to survive a little longer because of good King Josiah. Josiah is that wonderful young king who discovered the law, which had been forgotten, probably the book of Deuteronomy. And he instituted the full Passover and the full rituals that had not been practiced for a long, long time. But again, it was too late even for Judah. Isaiah and after him Jeremiah kept prophesying that God would also destroy the southern kingdom. And in fact, the Assyrian kingdom was defeated by the Babylonians, and it was the Babylonians who came and defeated the southern kingdom, and in the year 586 destroyed the temple of Solomon and sent the people of Israel into captivity. And we call this the Babylonian captivity. So 722 was the end of the northern kingdom. 586, again, because of good King Hezekiah and Josiah, Judah lived almost another 150 years. But in 586, it was gone. The great kingdom, the great monarchy started by Saul and David was gone, and the best people were sent into exile. And again, we call this the Babylonian captivity. And during the Babylonian captivity, the greatest of the Jews, of the Israelites, was a young man named Daniel. And Daniel was sent to Babylon along with his friends Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And those are actually their foreign names, but they're better known that way. And he was put under the famous King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And the story of Daniel may be the most exciting story in the whole book, in the whole Old Testament, because we see how God worked with Daniel and his friends there in exile in Babylon. In the first chapter, we find out that Daniel and his friends are refusing to eat the fancy meat and wine served by the Babylonians. Now, they weren't doing this because they were vegetarians in our sense of the word, but because they knew that all of the meat and wine were sacrificed to the pagan idols of Babylon. And so they refused. But that's going to get them in trouble because you're always supposed to look healthy and ruddy and stuff when you're in front of the king. And so Daniel and the boys said, we'll make a deal with you. Give us only vegetables for a month and water. And if after a month we look gaunt, then we'll eat your meat. But if we look even more healthy, then you must honor us. And in fact, they did. God honored them and they were lifted up. But then later on, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had a dream that troubled him. And he called his magi to him and said, explain my dream. And they said, well, tell us your dream and we'll interpret it. No. You tell me my dream and then we'll interpret it. He said, what? That's impossible, king. Nobody can do that. He said, okay, I'm going to kill you all. But then Daniel, who has a gift of interpreting dreams, learns of this. And he goes to the king and he says, King, I am not all wise, but there is a God in heaven who knows all things. And I, by his power, will tell you your dream and its meaning. And the dream is called the dream of the giant. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a giant made of 4 metals. The head was made of gold, the breast was made of silver, the belly was made out of bronze, and the legs were made out of iron and a little bit of terracotta. And in the dream, the giant was huge, but then this stone, uncut by human hand, fell down, smashed the toes, destroyed the giant. The giant blew away in the wind, but the stone grew into a mountain. What does it mean? Daniel said, O king, the 4 metals are 4 kingdoms. First is the head of gold. That is you, O mighty king, Babylon. But you will be followed by another great kingdom, and they will be followed by a third and then a fourth. And during the fourth is when God will establish his own kingdom. Now, Babylon was followed by Persia. That's the silver. Persia was followed by Greece, in other words, Alexander the Great. And finally, the Greek Empire was followed by the Roman Empire. And it was, in fact, during the early days of the Roman Empire that Jesus was born and the Messiah established his kingdom. An amazing, amazing prophecy. And Daniel was lifted up for that prophecy. But then the three boys had some trouble because Nebuchadnezzar decided to build an idol in honor of himself and force all the people to worship that idol. Well, the three young men refused to do that, and in anger, Nebuchadnezzar threw them in a fiery furnace. But God was with them, and they refused. They said, "We will not bow, O king, for we serve a God who can save us. But even if he doesn't save us, we will not bow to this idol." And so they were thrown in the fiery furnace. But later, Nebuchadnezzar looked in the hole on the bottom, and he saw the three boys were still there. And he said, "Did not I throw three young men? But there's a fourth one, and he looks like a son of God." And so the three, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, were taken out of the fiery furnace. Not only was their hair not singed, nothing of their cloak, they did not even have the smell of the fire. But the evil counselors who had actually egged Nebuchadnezzar on to do this, that though he would kill them, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Well, later on, Daniel made another prophecy that if Nebuchadnezzar did not get rid of his pride, God would strike him down. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar was struck down and lived like a wild animal. But afterwards, he looked up his eyes to heaven, and God restored his sanity, and he praised the God of Daniel. Now, after that, a long period goes by. It doesn't look like that when you're reading it, but like 50 years goes by, because eventually the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar would fall to the great Persian Empire of Cyrus when Belteshazzar was king. Now, at this point, Daniel's like 80 years old, and Belteshazzar is having a big banquet in which he brings out the goblets from the temple, the old temple that had been destroyed, and defiles them to have an orgy with. And while he's doing it, suddenly a hand appears and writes on the wall. Nobody can interpret it. They bring in Daniel. He's about 80 years old. They bring in Daniel, and he interprets the writing on the wall and what it means. That basically you have been measured, and you are going to fall, and the Persians will take your land. And that very night, Babylon fell to Persia, and the Babylonians were no more, and the Persians under Cyrus became the next great kingdom. Right? That's the kingdom of silver, the Persian Empire. But a little bit later, Daniel fell foul of the Persian leader, once again because the jealousy of the advisors wanted Daniel to be taken down a notch. And so they told the king, "Make a decree that nobody can pray to anyone but you for the next 30 days. Well, of course, Daniel didn't do that, and so he was thrown into a lion's den. But, like the boys in the fiery furnace, God was with him and closed the mouths of the lion. Daniel was taken out, and the evil people that were against him were thrown into the lion's den. Now, listen to what I said a moment ago. Daniel was at least 80 years old when he was thrown in the lion's den. Makes for a different picture, doesn't it? We always imagine a young, strapping 20-year-old. No, just like Moses was 80 when he saw the burning bush, he might have even been 90, but he was at least 80 because a long period had passed. But God watched over the Jews in. Now, here's an amazing thing. Isaiah is writing about 700 BC, and in one of his prophecies, he prophesies that a king named Cyrus will rise up and will help the Jews after the Babylonian captivity. And guess what? The first king of Persia, was named Cyrus, and Cyrus was a good king who practiced a sort of religious tolerance. He allowed all of his people to worship their own gods. He was a very pious person. And about 70 years or 50 years, depends how you date it, but 50 to 70 years after the Babylonian captivity, God raised up Cyrus, a pagan who does not know Yahweh, raised him up, and he decreed that the Jews could return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And amazingly, the Bible refers to Cyrus as an anointed one, a Messiah, not the Messiah, but anointed by God. Here, just like Nebuchadnezzar is forced to worship God, Cyrus is used by the God of the Bible to allow the Jews to return and rebuild the temple. And if you read the shorter books of Ezra and Nehemiah, both of those books tell the story of how the Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem and over a long period rebuild the temple. This is what we call the second temple. Uh, and that second temple was built, and again, the Jews were allowed to return. Now, I mentioned before that the Persian Empire. Okay, first there was Cyrus, and then there was Cambyses, and then there was a guy named Darius, and then there was a man named Xerxes. Now, in 490 BC, Darius attacked Greece and almost destroyed it, but he was defeated at the Battle of Marathon. He went back, and 10 years later, his son Xerxes, a wild man, decided, I am going to destroy the Greeks. And in the year 480, Xerxes went out, marched a huge army over to Greece, but was defeated at Thermopylae. That's the Battle of the 300 Spartans and the Battle of Salamis. And Xerxes was defeated, and Greece remained a free place, eventually giving way to Alexander the Great. Now, not from Athens, but from Greece, northern Greece. Now, I mention this because Xerxes, the same Persian king who almost destroyed the Jews, almost destroyed the Greeks, also almost destroyed the Jews. If you read the beautiful book of Esther, Esther was a Jewish woman, but she was hiding because she was living in Susa, in the capital of the Babylonian. And rather than go back to Israel, a lot of the Jews stayed behind because they enjoyed the high living of the sort of Persian court and whatnot. And because of an evil advisor named Haman, he got Xerxes to almost destroy the Jewish people. It would have been a Holocaust, quite literally. But God raised up Esther to intercede for the Jews and prevent Xerxes from carrying out his decree of killing the Jews. And that moment when the Jews were saved is called Purim, and that's a festival that's still celebrated by Jews today. It's just interesting that the same Persian king almost destroyed both the Greeks and the Jews. And yet again, by God's providence, they were saved. Now, there are many other prophets. There was a prophet named Ezekiel who prophesied to the exiles. There were a lot of minor prophets, not just Daniel, but others. The last prophet was named Malachi. And Malachi lived about 400 BC. And Malachi is the last book of the Bible. Because after Malachi, God ceased to speak directly to the Jews. That was the end, and there was a silence for 400 years. The last thing that Malachi said is God would send Elijah again to bring the hearts of his people back. And Elijah turns out to be John the Baptist, who prepared the way for Jesus. Now, the Old Testament ends there in 400 BC. And like I said, there is a silence where God does not speak again until John the Baptist begins to speak in the wilderness. But we have other books that tell us about the interim period between 400 and when John the Baptist starts preaching. And we call this the intertestamental period. And there are a series of books known as the Apocrypha. What are these books? These are books that, around 200, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. We call it the Septuagint. And all of a sudden, these extra books showed up that are in Greek, but we have no Hebrew original for them. And so these books are not in the Protestant Bible, but they are in the Catholic Bible. And they're respected by many Protestants as well. And there are other stories that tell about what happened in between. And there's two books called the Maccabees, and they tell us a little bit about the intertestamental period. Okay, um, remember I told you that Greece was able to defeat Persia, but they didn't really defeat them. About 100 years later, in the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great rose up, and a little bit of payback, he went into Persia and defeated the Persians and ended up taking all of the Middle East. He took what today is Turkey, Iraq, Iran, all the way down to India. He took the Holy Land, he took Egypt, and he built the great empire of Alexander the Great. But when Alexander the Great died young, and he had no heirs, his kingdom, they call it the Hellenistic kingdom of Alexander the Great, was divided amongst 4 of his soldiers. Eventually, though, it became 3 of his soldiers. And one soldier was named Antigonus, and his descendants, the Antigonids, ended up controlling Macedonia and Greece. Then there was another soldier named Seleucus, and his people, the Seleucids, ended up controlling what we think of as Asia. And then there was Ptolemy, and the rich Ptolemies controlled Egypt. That was the great line that went from Ptolemy and ended with Cleopatra. Now, the Holy Land ended up falling in between the purview of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. For a good period, the Ptolemies controlled the Jews and treated them pretty well. But in the 2nd century, the Seleucids came in and seized control of the Holy Land, and a maniacal leader named Antiochus Epiphanes seized control, and he decided he was going to take the Jews, these rustic people, and Hellenize them, and make them like the Greeks, and make them worship the Greek gods. And in 166 BC, he even defiled the Second Temple, defiled the temple itself. Well, that was too much. There was a family known as the Maccabees, and they rose up in revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus, who led a revolt and overthrew the Seleucids. And for about 100-year period, the Jews once again controlled the Holy Land. It was a smaller version of the Holy Land, but they did control it. But again, unfortunately, sinfulness, they started playing political games and whatnot, and eventually they would fall to the Romans. But I do want to mention one story. When the Jews were holding out against Antiochus Epiphanes before Judas Maccabeus defeated him, there was a period when the Jews were holed up in the temple and they only had a limited amount of oil and they would have to give up. But God miraculously caused the oil not to run out. And the moment it ran out is when Judas Maccabeus came to the rescue. And that story of the oil is where Hanukkah comes from. That 7 days of Hanukkah when the oil did not run out and God protected his people. All right, now, again, for about 100 years, the Jews sort of controlled it under the Maccabees. But in the year 63, the great Roman soldier Pompey marched into Rome, seized Jerusalem, and took it back for Rome, and put a puppet king there, and that was the family of the Herods that you've heard of. Now, Herod the Great was the great king when Jesus was born, probably about 4 BC. They seem to have messed up the dates. 4 or 5 BC is when Jesus was born, because Herod the Great died in 4 BC and Jesus was born before he died, if you know those stories. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video. But just to kind of bring it up to date, it was during the reign of Caesar Augustus, who was the first emperor of Rome, and he finally became emperor of Rome after he destroyed the last of the Greek emperors, and that was Cleopatra, and defeated her, and in 27 BC declared himself Caesar Augustus. And it was during the reign of the first Roman emperor that Jesus was born. Jesus was crucified and rose again under the second emperor, and that is the adopted son of Caesar Augustus, Tiberius. And during the time of Tiberius is when the son of Herod the Great, who tried to kill the Christ child, he was the one, Herod Antipas, who also was there when Jesus was crucified, and that was also the time of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And so again, that's the story of the Jews of the Old Testament in a nutshell, from the patriarchs to the Exodus to the conquest of Canaan, to the period of judges, followed by the kings, followed by the divided monarchy and the sort of reign of the prophets, ending with the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 by Assyria, the destruction of the southern kingdom by Babylon in 586, the exile, followed by the Jews being allowed by Cyrus to go back and rebuild the temple, and again, finally taking us down to the birth of Christ. And that is what I will be celebrating, and many of you, in 3 days. Thank you for listening. And again, if you look under my picture, you'll see the outline with all the names that I talked about in this video.